Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted. And here we have Anikthea, Hand of Erebos. This is an enchantment deck, an enchantment reanimator deck, I would say. This deck comes to us from Modern Heretic, who says, deck feels too slow and is very vulnerable to each player loses X life effects, which is very interesting. I have some theories on both of these, why this is happening, but we'll get to that soon. And for their restrictions, they say, I'm trying to avoid stacks pieces, which we can definitely work with. Anikthea is a commander I've been wanting to play for a while, so I've been excited to take a look at this deck because I think it's very inspiring to see people's decks and to see what they have done so that you can figure out what you'd like to do when you build it yourself. And Anikthea gets a lot of thoughts going in my head, so very excited to take a look at this deck. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. Alright, so Anikthea, Hand of Erebos is a 5-mana demigod, legendary enchantment creature, 4/4, in Abzan colors. That's white, black, and green. They have menace. They give other enchantment creatures you control menace, but the main reason we are using this ability is whenever Anikthea enters the battlefield or attacks, exile up to one target non-aura enchantment card from your graveyard. Create a token that's a copy of that card, except for it's a 3/3 black zombie creature in addition to its other types. So, what's cool about this is, first of all, something I really find flavorfully fun is that Anikthea is a Titan. I've said this before, but what I mean by that, I mean by the, enter the battlefield effect and attack effect that cards like Sun Titan, Grave Titan, Primeval Titan all have. So she's a Titan, which is really interesting as she is a demigod for a god in a plane where gods and Titans actually mean something, and Titans have a flavor, effect in their world. So that's really cute to me. I really do like that. But otherwise, she's also very, very strong. She has a repeatable reanimate effect that will trigger both when she's cast and enters the battlefield and every turn when she attacks. That's really, really impressive. I will say that a 4/4 at this amount of mana feels a bit weaker, but with Menace, it's not that big of a deal, and you should always have someone to attack with. And so the goal of a deck that has Anikthea at the helm is definitely to reanimate some really, really strong enchantments and take advantage of that ability. So let's see what we've got. This deck was sent over Archidect, so I have transferred it over to Moxfield, where I find it a lot easier to work with. I hope that's okay. Now, there's one of these things that I do think about when I work on these decks is that I don't get to be there as you build the deck. I don't get to see what kind of choices and where those choices come from. And I always find that interesting. Some decks I take a look at and I wonder if there's budgetary concerns that the deck builder hasn't talked about. Like a lot of the cards come from their own collection. Sometimes I look and I notice that a lot of cards come from a commander set or a different set. And I wonder if the deck builder had opened a bunch of that and had those cards on their mind. Sometimes I wonder if decks went to EDH Rec and were built that way. It's something that you can kind of taste, much like, when you taste food, you can kind of taste how people were cooking it and what thoughts they might have been doing when they put the whole thing together. And I feel that a lot with the decks that I'm looking at. And this one is really interesting to me because there's a lot of choices that kind of pique my interest, and I wonder where those choices come from. Unfortunately, a lot of those choices are confusing to me and not so delightful. But that's okay. That's what we're here for. We're here to find these kind of things that, deck builders may not see and to try to work them out and try to find out how to fix them. So we're going to go through a bunch of them. It's going to be a bit picky. I don't mean it to be too critical, but there's some things that are kind of alarm bells in my mind. And the first one, if you've opened the deck on your own side, you may have noticed as well, is the fact we're running 32 lands. 32 lands is heartbreaking to me. That is so few lands. And this is not the kind of deck that plays a lot of ramp at low mana. We actually have no mana dorks at 1 mana in the deck, though we have some good, where are we? Sanctum Weaver is a very good ramp spell. It is one that traditionally gets explosive, when you hit critical mass, and is not that great early in the game. Is also very vulnerable to removal, because if you play this turn 2, I will definitely bolt this creature. And when you do, well, until Anikthea brings her back, I mean, she's not doing much, and if that was your only 2 lands in your hand, you're in a really bad position. But you might say, well, Curse though, we've got some lands, enchantments that can enchant our lands in order to get more of them out of, and mana out of them, and we have Exploration. Well, this is where the first few interesting points that I'd like to point out are. The first one being Exploration notably doesn't really do much until mid to late game. When our engines are functioning, because this is an engine deck, we are drawing so many cards, right? We have so many Enchantress effects, and every time we play anything, we're going to get so many cards out of it. But until we get that going, we only have so many cards in hand, and we only have so many lands in our deck. So Exploration, even on turn 1, might not be that impactful. Yeah, turn 1, that's great, you get to play that second land out of your hand, but turn 2, when you play that third land, and that's it, you're kind of in a bad position. This hasn't really accelerated you. This is just really going to be much better later in the game. And I would say mid-game is where this deck shines, and you don't need more help then. Though I'm not going to say get rid of Exploration, I'm going to say we need more lands, is more than I'm getting at. Wild Growth is fine, but something that's really interesting to me is Utopia Sprawl. Because I was looking at this deck, and I started noticing something. And what I noticed was how many forests are actually in the deck. So we have 3 forests here. We have a Triome, that's 4. We have Murmuring Bosk, that's 5. Overgrown Tomb, that's 6. And Temple Garden, that's 7. I see also Radiant Grove, that's 8. That's maybe a little too low for this to actually hit, very often. I think this card wouldn't be as bad if we had a much larger collection of fetch lands, or more than just Fabled Passage. If we had a bunch of fetch lands, then I would be like, okay, this isn't a problem. But at the moment, we definitely do not have enough fetch lands for this to actually work. And therefore, I fear a lot of the times Utopia Sprawl won't have anything to enchant early game. Now, as I said before, later in the game, this is something that's going to be fine. You can definitely cast this later in the game, but not early when you need it the most. So this is one of those things that's really kind of piquing my interest of how this happens. So this needs to be fixed for sure. Then we've got a few cards here that kind of just catch my eye, and the one I want to take the most amount of time with is Out of Time. I guess the pun wasn't intended. So Out of Time is a relatively simple enchantment. You play Out of Time, all the creatures phase out, then eventually, because this has Vanishing, Out of Time will be sacrificed, and all creatures will phase back in. Pretty straightforward. What happens when Out of Time is a creature? Well, you notice something. Out of Time has an enter the battlefield effect. It says untap all creatures, then those creatures phase out until Out of Time leaves the battlefield. Your first gut instinct might be, oh, okay, Curse, it just doesn't do anything. It's a creature, it phases itself out, and then it's left the battlefield and everything phases back in. That's actually not true. Phasing out doesn't leave the battlefield. So when this becomes a 3/3 creature, and comes into battlefield, there's an ETB, and if it's not destroyed, everything phases, all creatures phase out permanently. Now, this is kind of an annoying thing to begin with, because one, those cards don't get to leave the battlefield. Maybe on MTGO it's easier to look at, but on paper, you know, all of those creatures have to stay in play for the rest of the game. They just cannot leave, and you cannot interact with them. So there's just a bit of clutter for the rest of the game. So a little annoying, not too bad. But if you're like, okay, it's just a board clear, what's the problem? What does it do to commanders, right? Once a commander phases out, you don't actually get to bring it back to the command zone. It's just phased out. And out of time, that means out of time will permanently phase out any commanders. And once again, you might say, well, that's pretty good, isn't it? How did you make out of time into a creature? And herein lies the problem. If you ever use Anikthea to turn out of time into a creature, and you cannot then destroy, exile, bounce, or do anything with Anikthea, with this trigger on the stack, you have lost your own commander for the rest of the game. And don't get me wrong, this is kind of funny to me. I think it's a really, really interesting thing. But I don't think it's intended. I don't think you want that. This deck really, really benefits from its commander. And so this glaring nombo is very interesting to me. Of course, there's going to be an argument made that you can just not reanimate out of time, but like, why would you include an enchantment that you absolutely don't want to reanimate, right? It seems like a mistake. So all this to say, out of time definitely should not be in the deck. Now, there's a few other things here and there that I kind of notice. So a lot here in this last section of creatures are things that I find really interesting, ignoring Eidolon of Blossoms and maybe the Dovehawk, but we'll go through them anyways. Agent of Erebos is a very interesting 4-mana card for this deck, because all it really does as an enchantment creature is exile people's graveyards. And it's going to exile people's graveyards repeatedly. How often do you need graveyards exiled, right? I generally prefer once to wipe once like a Bojuka Bog effect, right? You wipe someone's graveyard once. Are we playing Bojuka Bog? We are. So you wipe someone's graveyard once, and that's usually enough for most decks. Only really, really aggressive graveyard decks that are really, really into self-mill, like yours, need constant exiling, right? So Agent of Erebos feels a bit heavy-handed, especially since we have Boseiju in our deck. Like, how often do we need to exile this? Can't we just play a different effect? Can't we play maybe Leyline, the black Leyline that exiles everyone else's graveyards instead? I think that would be better. It doesn't ETB exile, but you have Bojuka Bog for it. I just feel like this is a really weird inclusion at the top of our curve, where Agent of Erebos is, you know, really specific because it's target player. And like, if we want this effect, I think like Shadow of the Author or Author of Shadow, Author of Shadows is like not an enchantment, don't get me wrong, but it's just like a better version where this ETBs exiles all opponents' graveyards, and then you get a card from there for the rest of the game that you can cast. Like, if this is like, we want something that exiles all graveyards, not just one, and not just one at a time, but repeatedly. It's a weird choice, so I think Agent of Erebos can easily be cut. Ajani's Chosen likewise is very interesting to me. And you know what? We're going to lump in Archon of Sun's Grace. I think one of the things that's catching my eye is this deck feels a little polarized in its power. Like, we have some really, really strong cards. Our instants are almost all incredibly powerful cards. Tutors, low mana interaction, Teferi's Protection. We have a lot of enchantments that are very, very strong, from like Smothering Tithe to like a lot of really good combos and cards that work well together, such as 3 Blind Mice or City of Death. We also have like Exploration, right? Like, we have the One Ring. We have a lot of strength here. And then we're kind of finishing the game with Archon of Sun's Grace. And that feels weird to me. Don't get me wrong, creating a bunch of tokens isn't bad, but it just doesn't feel like the thing we should be doing. Almost everything else in our deck already creates the number of tokens we need, such as Anikthea creating her own tokens, We have Legion Loyalty creating myriad tokens. We have a bunch of populate cards. It just feels weird to have these two that create kind of lower, dramatically lower power tokens. The one thing I will say is the Pegasus creatures do have evasion and lifelink, and I do like that, but I'm going to give a better solution to lifelink, and we haven't quite talked about the life loss problem. Likewise, I'll take a moment to point out Bitter Blossom and to an extent Awakening Zone as both cards that I think have the same problem, where their main contribution, let's say, to the deck is token generation, and they're both not really good at token generation when it comes to Commander. I know these are staples in terms of tokens over the years, but we've long since learned that we want tokens to be generated on other triggers outside of upkeeps, right? Unless it's each upkeep, we want tokens to be generated on attacks, on landfall, on certain types of permanents entering the battlefield, that kind of stuff, on cast. On upkeep means in a game that lasts 7 turns, if you cast Awakening Zone on turn 3, you get about 4 Eldrazi spawn, and that doesn't feel really meaningful, at least to me. I will say the Eldrazi spawn I like a little more, especially since our mana is so harsh in this deck that I don't mind it as much, but Bitter Blossom, just notably, I don't think belongs here. And I will say the same for Ajani's Chosen, and even Archon of Sun's Grace. Eidolon of Blossoms is a wonderful card, don't mind that. Nesting Dovehawk, I kind of have a hard time with this card, but in this deck, I think it does really, really well, so I have no problem here. It's at that perfect rate where it is played like the turn before our commander comes out, so that when we go to combat after playing Anikthea, we're going to get basically get 2 copies of whatever enchantment we reanimate, and I love that. I think that's really, really good. So Nesting Dovehawk is very strong here, and I really do like it here. Doomwig Giant is also something that catches my eye. I feel like, I don't know the strength of this card in your playgroup, because your playgroup makes me feel like this isn't good enough, but it's here anyways, right? Like, Doomwig Giant is an interesting card, but at high levels, it really doesn't do much. It does clean up mana dorks, I like that. It cleans up a lot of 2/1s we like Lotus Cobra, Death Shadow, Thalia. I said Death Shadow, sorry, Dark Confidant. Don't play Death Shadow in Commander. But outside of that, I think a lot of stronger, like high-powered, not EDH decks don't really care for -1/-1 per turn, even like -3/-3 across the board. I could be wrong, but it just seems notable to me that this is where our curve kind of ends for creatures. We don't have anything bigger or anything smashier. We have really interesting enchantments, and don't get me wrong, these work really well with Doomwig Giant. I guess that makes it fine. The combination of cards is really interesting, but it is notable that this is like one of the biggest creatures we've got by themselves. So with that in mind, I'm going to look through. There's a few cards here. Okay, there's some cards here that I find are win more. Oh, wait, before we get that, Defense of the Heart is another one that really catches my eye. Defense of the Heart is a combo, like an aggressive combo card, right? During your upkeep, if one of your opponents controls 3 or more creatures, you sacrifice this, you immediately put 2 creatures into play. This should, in most decks, win you the game or grant such overwhelming card advantage that you are about to win the game. This deck can't do that. What are the 2 cards you pick? And I'm going to be honest, I think it's going to be like Sithis and maybe Eidolon of Blossoms, or Sithis and maybe, where are you? The Weaver, no, not the Weaver, where's Sanctum Weaver? Yeah, it was the Weaver, it's the other one. So Sanctum Weaver, Sithis, or maybe if you really needed Dryad, Sithis for the mana fixing. Like, those are the 2 cards I will grab, right? Right? I'm having a hard time thinking what else. Like, maybe perhaps, because Sithis is cast, you might even want Eidolon of Blossoms and Sanctum Weaver to draw 2 cards and have mana. Like, that still doesn't feel good enough, right? This is the kind of card that you want to be dropping, like, you know, Elish Norn or some kind of stone. What is our big stompy guy? Can never forever. So I'm gonna say the Moonlight Cavalry instead because I can never remember the green one. You know, something that immediately allows you to attack and win and defeat all your opponents, not get the value play of 2 more engine pieces. So this card, it just strikes me really odd. This is another one of those cards that makes me wonder what was the thoughts of the deck builder. But I will also say this card is very dangerous for you to play because if you play this, I'm gonna knock you out of the game. Like if I cannot interact with Defense of the Heart, I'm gonna do my best to knock you out of the game with the help of my other, my other opponents to work together to take you out because this is terrifying. You know, you can sit there and tell me that there's nothing good in your deck to draw, but no, I'm not gonna let you get away with that. I'm still gonna put you in the ground as fast as I can because I just don't know what this card can do. Like Doomwake Giant and something else, I guess, could even be really good on certain boards. But like, still, you don't have the win, but I don't know that, so I'm going to treat it as if it's the most dangerous thing. Okay, with that in mind, going back to what I wanted to talk about before I started talking about that card is I feel like there's a few enchantments here and there that I would consider to be win more. So let's talk about what win more is again, because I do think it's always important to talk about. Win more. So cards are good in 3.5, there's a fourth, but 3.5, sections of the game. When you're behind, when you're at neutral, and when you are ahead. And the 0.5 is if this card requires or is better or is playable at all with your commander out. The cards that are good in all sorts of, all parts of that, like Sol Ring, which is always good, is a great card. You've got a great card there. But cards that are only good when you're ahead and or only good with your commander out are what we consider win more. Your deck is already doing what it wants it to do. It now just lets you win more than you were winning before, right? And your deck has quite a few of these cards. Doubling Season, Parallel Lives, Hollowed Haunting, Growing Ranks, there we go. Anointed Procession, 3 Blind Mice, City of Death are the ones that pop out at me immediately. Now, I'm not saying taking these cards out because these are really, really strong cards, but I think you need to note that these cards are just win more. So some of them I really do like, of course, like Song of the World Soul feels like a win condition. Obviously the doublers, Doubling Season are really good, though notably I do believe, I wonder if this comes in as a token, like it doesn't create another copy. This is a question, sorry, that we have to go and see. Let's do the white one because I think it's the highest chance of having the right things. It doesn't seem to say what happens if this comes in as a token. Okay, I think maybe we need to double check that, but my understanding is these things will see themselves coming in, but will they see themselves as being created? And that I'm not sure. So if they do, if these cards, like specifically things like Parallel Lives, which let's search Parallel Lives. Oops, I did that backwards. If Parallel Lives coming in as a token, okay, it doesn't say. So if these cards come in as tokens, do they see themselves being created and create another copy of themselves? If so, I like them a lot more. If not, I like them less. But that rules question we can answer at another time. I think one of the things about these is just the sheer number of them, is that we have so many cards like Parallel Lives that just really benefit you when your deck is doing the good thing, but don't do anything otherwise. Like, Something to consider is, let's just say for the sake of argument, that when we bring Parallel Lives back as a zombie, it comes in as 2 zombies. That's pretty cool. But what does that mean really? It means that on our first turn that we've summoned Anikthea, all we've done is get 2 3/3s. Now those 2 3/3s are going to be really, really powerful when the turn cycle completes and we get to use Anikthea again. But until then, they're just 2 3/3s. They're very vulnerable to removal. They haven't gotten you any advantage. And, you know, the right kind of board wipe or kill spell or interaction basically negates this entire turn. Whereas something like Smothering Tithe is much more guaranteed to give you advantage. Something like City of Death will at least create that treasure token, right? Something like Sterling Grove always has the threat of sacrificing. So I like those a lot more than all of these. Like Growing Ranks, you need to make it to your upkeep in order to get another copy of Growing Ranks. Like, it feels cool, but it's really not getting you ahead. It's so slow. And so like these cards I feel are a lot weaker than the rest of the deck, and I want to pressure these cards as much as I can. And I think that's generally the cards I want to talk about in your deck. I have additions, and I have some cards that you have in your sideboard that I'd like to add. So let's start with my additions, and then let's come back to some of these sideboard cards that I think are interesting. So one card that I think is, some of these might be already in your sideboard. I may have missed them, but one of the cards that I would like to add is Sevinne's Reclamation. This is just really nice because it's 3 mana to reanimate one of your enchantments, and then from the graveyard, it gets flashbacked for 5. This is just really good, right? Not only does this work with a lot of your like mill, like such as Mesmeric Orb, so that you still get to use it, but it's just like really cleanly early game or just after you've gotten your Anikthea trigger to grab just another enchantment or another creature out. So I think this is just a very easy inclusion here. Let's say, actually, before we go on, let's go back and talk about something you were talking about so that I can, my next 2 additions will be with that in mind. And I should have done this earlier. So the deck builder, a Modern Heretic has said that a problem this deck has is that it has rocky starts. I'm just going to get the real, it says deck feels too slow and is very vulnerable to each player loses X life effects. Now what I'm going to suggest, I'm going to suggest the reason that feels slow is the lands. I think that's the main reason there. But it's always going to be a little slow because it's an engine deck. Engine decks take a while to get going. But the reason I think it loses to each player lose X life effects is because it doesn't have quick win conditions. So cards like Sphere of Safety are really good at defending you. So it would be... where is our 3 mana? Solitary Confinement are really good at defending you from creatures, and Solitary Confinement is really good at direct damage spells that target you, right? This is very good. Now, this is the card that makes me think why you specifically say lose X life, because that's the only way around Solitary Confinement. And I have 2 things to say with that. The first one is, this is my theory. My theory is that you can't finish games fast enough, and you're letting the decks that have massive lose life effects win, because those decks are generally slower decks. Think Aristocrats with Zulaport Cutthroat triggers, think Torment of Hailfire or Exsanguinate decks. Those are generally the ways that you make your opponents lose tremendous amounts of life without targeting them, right? And with that in mind, you're just not pressuring those decks, and they're given enough time to amass their own engines or their critical mass of mana to use those spells to take you out. But I have another thought, and that other thought is I think you're leaning on this card a little too hard, because this might just be a guess, but from the way you use your language and the way this card comes to mind, is this card does not make you indestructible, and you shouldn't treat it as such. This is a card that buys you time. When I play my Eiley deck, and you can go and find, I have a video in my channel about that Eiley deck and how it works, I gain literally billions of life when the combo goes off, and the combo goes off nearly every game. Nearly every game, I have 1 billion or more life. I do not treat that as I am indestructible or I cannot be defeated. And solitary confinement is very much so the same thing. You have bought yourself time, not an enormous amount of time, but time nonetheless. Even if you have solitary confinement, even if you have, Sterling Grove in solitary confinement, even if you have 2 copies of Sterling Grove in solitary confinement, do not consider yourself untouchable. There are ways for your opponents to take you out. And with that in mind, we have to make sure that we can finish the game at a speedy rate. And I think a big part of that is the lands. I think you're struggling to get these cards out in a reasonable fashion in order to speed up your engine enough. But with that in mind, let's go back to the cards I want to suggest. And one of them very notably is, or 2 of them, is Beast Within and Stroke of Midnight. I think you need ways to interact with some of these combos that will take you out of the game this way. So it's not every card, like someone who is casting a very large Torment of Hailfire, you will not be able to stop them with these cards. And I think with that in mind, like these will at least help, right? They'll get rid of Bastion of Remembrance. They'll get rid of, Blood Artists. They'll pressure your opponents, like their draw engines and stuff like that. And I think that will help a lot because right now you have very little interaction. And honestly, if you want to keep the power level of the deck high, you might even just play Nature's Claim, right? Which is just 1 mana and it hits a lot of really relevant enchantments and artifacts. So these are the interaction suites that I would like you to have. Another thing that I would want before we get into some more value and win conditions is Necropotence. I feel like Necropotence is notably missing. Now this card is pretty hard for you to cast right now without fetch lands. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether or not you play fetch lands, but if you grab the fetch lands, Necropotence is your friend. You do not currently have any cards that just draw you cards, and Necropotence is one of them. The other one is Rowan's Grim Search. This one is also really good because you have a lot of means to do the bargain, and it's just a card at instant speed that will draw you cards. And I really think that's important, especially in engine decks. We kind of get like, how do we put this, tunnel visioned into what our strategy is, and we think, okay, I'm in enchantments, enchantresses will be how I draw. And they are really, really good at what they do, but sometimes you're going to be out of enchantresses and out of ways to just play a lot of enchantments, and you just need draw. And both of these cards, this one's at least an enchantment, but Rowan's Grim Search is also very, very good. These will get you cards, so I would recommend them as well. Then let's look at, these are meant to be finishers, but this one I think is also notably, I think this one's also notably kind of an enabler, and it's Deadbridge Chant. So Deadbridge Chant mills 10 when it enters the battlefield, and then on upkeep, you choose a card at random, creature cards get reanimated, and the rest go into your hand. And what I really like about this is what this actually reads as is you reanimate this with Anikthea, you mill 10 so you have more to work with, and then if this card lives, every upkeep, you basically draw a card. You could get lucky and you can get a creature. I would probably not rely on it, but every upkeep you will draw a card from your graveyard into your hand and most likely be able to cast it. And I do really, really like that, right? So I think this is strong, it's cheap, and it's 6 mana to cast, so you're not usually casting it, but I think it's a really smart card that you can have a lot of fun with and gain some long-term advantage. But let's talk win conditions. The first one, I think, is another way. I talked about lifelink long ago and how to get around the fact that your opponents might drain your life out of the game. And True Conviction, I think, is the answer to that. This is a card I don't always love in aggressive decks, but in enchantment decks that can turn those enchantments into creatures, I think this is really, really strong. That 6 mana is a lot easier when we cheat this into play with Anikthea, and I think its immediate double strike and lifelink abilities are just going to be really, really nice. With only a few attacks, you'll find yourself having enough life that you'll be in a really good position, and Double Strike allows your 3/3s. Like Menace, Double Strike, Lifelink is a really good combination because your creatures are probably going to survive through a lot more combats than they would otherwise. And with Menace, the chances of your creatures being unblocked are even higher, ensuring that no matter what, you'll get at least the full life and pressure down your opponents. The other one, which I think is a lot stronger, but is also a little more expensive at about $20 American, is Virtue of Persistence. And I really, really like this virtue. And I think I should probably look up the other virtues, but this is the one I know the most. So Loyalty and Strength. So Virtue of Persistence is removal at sorcery speed, which I really like on the adventure. And the other side is just reanimate every turn. I think I thought this discarded itself. I'm sorry. I just realized it goes on an adventure. Okay, this is fine then. This is just fine. I think if you can discard this and reanimate it, it's fine. I completely changed my mind. Ignore this. I completely forgot that adventure goes into exile and not your graveyard. Do not think too much of me. Yeah, this won't be good either. Okay, never mind. True Conviction is your win condition. But I will take a moment to talk before we finish up here. I will take a moment to talk about some cards that I really, really like in your sideboard that I tend to suggest a lot, and I think might be the answer you are seeking. Now, you noted that you don't want stacks. I might consider these cards stacks, but you don't, and that's all I need to know. So, what are these cards? These cards are Bottomless Pit, Necrogen Mists, Oppression, Painful Quandary, and Eldest Reborn. So all of these, let's go through them real quickly. Bottomless Pit is a discard at every turn, each upkeep, and Oppression is whenever a player casts a spell, that player discards a card. And where are we? Necrogen Mist is also each player's upkeep, they discard a card, except for Bottomless Pit is random, which makes it a bit better. So let's start with those three. Why do I love those three? Well, every single one of them is likely to trigger before it gets back to your turn. The ones that trigger on upkeep trigger on your opponent's upkeep, which is really, really quickly. And Oppression will be reactive to any spell cast by your opponents. I really like this. I think this is fantastic. You're going to be very, very happy with these results when you reanimate them, and you're going to have a pretty good time. So, unlike a lot of your enchantments, they will have an effect almost immediately. Then we move on to the bigger ones, mainly these cards that I consider to be pretty much finishers, and they are Painful Quandary, which is a finisher I really, really like, which has the same tag where or trigger where your opponent's casts trigger this, so you're going to get that advantage very, very quickly, and anyone who's played with this card knows the amount of damage this card can do is very, very high. It's also like, so when we play against, when we play higher power commander, when someone drops an incredibly powerful piece, someone has to usually deal with it. And if they're using 1-for-1 removal, they're kind of going to be behind by doing so. I'm trying to think, recently I was playing a game and one of my opponents dropped a card that I immediately dealt with. And I can't remember what it was, but regardless what it was, is I knew I was putting myself back against my other two opponents by going 1-for-1 with that one opponent. And it didn't feel good, but I did understand it was a decision that I had to make. This is worse, because this is when, in order for me to bolt this creature, let's say that's the interaction I want to do, I have to give up 5 life, which I probably will, or discard a card, especially early game, hurts a lot. I'm going down 2 cards to deal with 1 card that was created off of a trigger. Like, that's really rough. That's really rough to deal with. So your opponents are very much so incentivized to not be the first one to remove the Painful Quandary, because they're just going to be putting themselves behind. But that means at some point they have to start casting spells, and as soon as they do, they're in a bad position because they have to start making those decisions. So Painful Quandary is a fantastic card. Cheating it into play or reanimating it is fantastic. I absolutely love that here. And Eldest Reborn, I think, is just a lot easier just to kind of understand why this is a strong card, but On ETB, each opponent goes down a card if they have a creature. On the second chapter, each opponent goes down a card from their hand. And the third one, you get to reanimate something. Perfect. Great. You're going to be very much so in control of the situation with that. And it's going to buy you time. And I think that's the big thing about all of these discard cards that I'm suggesting from your sideboard, is that they will buy you time to get your combo, get your engines going. And the last one I want to say from your sideboard, another black card, as we know, I am very much a black mage, but Unmarked Grave definitely feels like it should be in the main board. It is another Entomb effect in a deck that really benefits from Entomb effects. And I think that's where I'm going to end this here. I say while looking up one more saga. Let's see if I can find it real fast. I was just thinking there is that Titan saga, right? The Binding of the Titans, each player mills 3, exile 2 graveyards, return a creature or land. This could be another good saga because it does mill out some cards for you to be able to get them back from the graveyard, and it returns a land that you may have milled. This one might be an easy inclusion. Okay, with that, I am going to say that's going to be my notes on the deck. I feel like I've been critical on parts of the deck. I really like the idea. I've also been thinking of Anikthea a lot, so it's kind of been on my mind, so it's easy for me to pick at these kind of things. But I do think there's a lot of strength in your deck. There's a lot of really powerful, like all the instants are insanely powerful. Your artifacts are really strong. A lot of your enchantments are very good. Your creatures are very good. This is a really good start to the deck. I think it just needs some cleaning up here and there in order for it to kind of solve the problems that you're feeling. Mainly, the mana needs to be fixed and the lands need to be increased, and after which some extra non-enchantment draw and some more win conditions that are just much more straightforward and aggressive is going to be very, very useful. And finally, putting all my cards on the table, looking at this collection of Painful Quandary, Eldritch Reborn, Oppression, Necrogen Mist, and Bottomless Pit, if I were to sit down and build Anikthea right now, which I won't, but I could, that is the collection of enchantments I would start with. I would start with those enchantments and start putting something together from there, because I think that would be the direction I would find to be the most powerful to start shutting down my opponents so that I can kind of build into one of these engines freely. But that's just my opinion, man. So with that in mind, thank you so much, Modern Heretic, for sending your deck. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck or a draft of any deck, you can check the video description down below. And if you'd like your deck to be brought up to the front of the queue, there's a link for that down there too. Finally, if you could like, comment, subscribe, I would be very, very grateful. We are so close to 400 subscribers. I think the little animation I've added does say 400, and that's probably a lie. I just rounded up because I figured someone retroactively looking. We're at 392. We're almost there. All right. Thank you so much for sending this deck, and good luck.